Welcome back, Sovereign Sister, to a very special episode of the Sovereign Sisterhood Movement podcast. Because today we're going to talk about something that, especially women, either misunderstand or they tuck under the rug because it's very taboo. There's a lot of fear around it. And ultimately, we as women don't even know how to heal from this, which is directly correlated to the generational healing journey. And what I'm talking about is grief and going beyond thinking that grief is just sadness. Grief is actually a change in who you are. It is a sacred process. It is how your nervous system breathes and learns to breathe again after trauma, and how your body carries love through your lineage, or how it also becomes blocked through your lineage because of grief. Now, in many of our families, grief was never allowed to move, whether because we didn't know how, or whether we came from a lineage that basically was living in constant survival. Our grandmothers were told to stay quiet and to just be strong, even when they were going through very traumatic experiences like the loss or transition of someone they loved. Our mothers also learned to survive by just staying busy, right? You have to keep moving forward. We don't have time to grieve. And many of us learned to cope by tightening the chest through addiction, by holding the breath. It's never why the addiction, but always why the pain. Because when grief has no ritual or there is no movement, then the body becomes the altar for the grief, which then turns into very serious illnesses and feeling pressure around your chest and feeling like you're constantly lost, depressed, or simply like life has no meaning. The breath shuts down during states of chronic stress when grief is not allowed to move through you. Your body literally is just trying to finish something that your lineage never got to complete. So today, as especially we honor El Día de los Muertos, the Day of the Dead this week, we're not only talking about death, we're talking about the circulation between the worlds, the spirit and the physical. We're talking about grief in the lungs and the lungs as a bridge to generational healing. And we're remembering that nothing is gained at birth and nothing is lost at death, like my teacher once told me in Kundalini Yoga therapist training. Today, we're going to connect with the respiratory system, with the lymphatic system that's part of the respiratory system, how that all connects to grief, generational trauma. And we're going to look at the journey of the soul and also the teachings of the Purépecha ancestors of El Día de los Muertos, and why ritual and understanding what happens after our last breath brings not only a sense of peace, but a way for grief to move through the altar. We're going to go deep into what your role is in completing these ancestral cycles when you are in the physical body. And we're going to get into the science and spirituality of it all. So I invite you to grab some coffee, grab some tea. If you have some sage around you, feel free to light that, maybe some palo santo, anything that's going to help you ground yourself back in your body. Because today on the Sovereign Sister Movement podcast, we're going to go through this journey of grief together so that you can end the cycle, not just for yourself, but for 7 generations before and after you. So, as you know, last week we were talking about the circulatory system. So, each week I've been taking you through a journey as a Kundalini Yoga therapist and training through each of the systems of our body and how generational trauma impacts the system, what the system is, and then how do we actually heal. And this week we're looking at the respiratory system. And through that, I want to take you through a journey of the anatomy of breath because we're going to talk a lot about the lungs and the lymph and that connection to grief and why generational trauma gets repeated when we don't clear the respiratory system and when we don't heal or allow grief to move through us. So let's start first by understanding what the respiratory system is And you don't have to be a scientist or a doctor. Knowledge is power, and it's important for you to understand just how wise your body and intelligent it already is, and how you can maximize its potential. Because ultimately, the potential of the body is for you to become enlightened, for you to accept the atonement, what Jesus Christ was teaching us. And we're even going to look at today some of the ways that the Bible, religion, let's just call it religion, has kept us away from honoring our ancestors, and why Jesus Christ was saying the complete opposite. So, first and foremost, the respiratory system is basically inclusive of your nose, sinuses, which filter the air, your trachea, which carries air to the lungs, your bronchi, which is like like a branch in a tree, and your lungs, which exchange all this prana, right? Oxygen and all these different abilities for us to literally interplay in this thing that we call life. And then there's your diaphragm, which is this dome-shaped muscle that actually allows the breath to move as well. So when you inhale, oxygen travels into the tiny sacs of the lungs that are actually called alveoli. And that oxygen enters into the bloodstream. Remember last week in our circulatory system episode, which I'll link below, we were talking about the bloodstream and how powerful each inhale and exhale is to change the chemical components of the blood from adrenaline and cortisol, which are the chemicals that make us really sick when we stay under high levels of stress, to actually highly alkalized blood, which changes your physical, mental, and spiritual health, and it changes the patterns of your lineage. So this is a breath is very important as it relates to your self-healing journey, and it's a very important aspect of Kundalini yoga therapy, because when we inhale, that oxygen is able to travel to these tiny little sacs that are feeding your brain, that are feeding your heart, your organs, your muscles, every cell of your body. If your cells are not receiving breath through meditation and prana, they might be receiving really negative uh, chemicals like adrenaline and cortisol, because every time you have a negative thought, you are, and this is what happens when we're under trauma patterns. We can't control our thoughts, we're not aware of them, and they just kind of repeat on their own, and we feel like we're slaves to them. So then that sends neuropeptides, which are chemicals, to your cells, and then the cells get sick. So this is why disrupting the pattern at the root cause is important, because we are literally poisoning our bodies by the thoughts that we're having when we don't learn how to breathe. And we don't know how to breathe because trauma causes us to basically breathe only from the belly button down, shallow breathing, because we're constantly in high alert, anxious, right? Waiting for the other shoe to drop. A large part of that is because the nervous system, as we know, gets stuck in fight and flight, and the brain is then wired for that as well. So it's constantly even protecting you from peace. It's used to the drama and the chaos. So that's where it sets the barometer, and it continues to create those experiences in life for you. So we need oxygen to enter into the bloodstream through meditation, right? To feed those lungs and the brain and the organs, to keep the fascia, which is this collagen, basically stretchy. Think of it as like a fluid that connects all of these organs together, and it gets dehydrated with when we have overwhelming emotions and we stay under chronic stress. So we have to hydrate it through meditation. And it's so important to do that because, as you know, we've talked about this several times, but fascia is piezoelectric, meaning it sends signals to your body and it stores memory. So when the trauma that you experienced as a child happened 50 years ago, your fascia and your body don't know the difference. And it's constantly sending signals to your breath, to your lungs, to everything as it relates to your body saying, I'm not safe, even if it happened 20, 50 years ago. And that's why it's so important for us to understand that scientifically, when your breath becomes shallow, your oxygen decreases. Foggy brain, right? Inability to stay in the present moment. And then what also happens is that inflammation increases. And then your immune system weakens. So you get sick a lot. And then your lymph stagnates. Remember last week we talked about the lymph? And we talked about how the fact that it does not have its own pump. So if it doesn't have its own pump and it requires your movement, and movement is not physical exercise like going to the gym, that's not enough because you're 10 layers of energy. We talked about the subtle anatomy of your body in the first episode of this series, which I'll link below so you can learn about the 10 layers of energy that you actually are, not just a physical body. So emotions clog up the lymph, right? And we're going to talk a little bit more about this in detail. But when this happens, that means that your lymph, which is supposed to be the trash picker, taking toxins out of your body, releasing them, those things just accumulate and then you get really sick, right? And that's the whole thing about grieving. When we are grieving, and I'm going to share with you some examples of what grief is, because it's not just the transition of someone we love or don't love, it's so many other ways that we move, that we need to process grief because of loss. But when we do grieve, the diaphragm tightens. And the reason why your diaphragm tightens, and this is very important as it relates to the respiratory system, is because what it's doing is it's guarding your heart. And it's not weakness, it's actually ancient biology just trying to protect us. So when people say, I feel like I can't breathe, if that's ever happened to you before, you're not being dramatic. Literally, it's your nervous system that's like closing the gate down because it's stuck in fight and flight. And the reason this is because we have to understand from a Kundalini yoga therapy perspective, breath is not just oxygen, it is literally prana. It's life force energy. And this is very important as it relates to your respiratory system because prana travels through what is known as the subtle body. So it travels through the nadis, which are meridian lines, which we talked a lot about in the first two episodes. So these meridian lines basically are channels where energy prana can travel through. But the thing is that if you have trauma that you experience, your emotions are not circulating, right? So the prana is not moving through the nadis. So it's not helping expand or contract your emotional safety. Grief is a series of contractions and expansions. And if that's why it feels so heavy, but it is the same process as birth. So when you are going, if you've ever had a baby, you may have taken classes. I remember with my first son, I took breathing classes to learn how to breathe through the labor process. It's the same thing when you're grieving, and it's the same thing when you're dying. Birth and death are the same process. So, what grief needs is for you to allow that to move, for the grief to move. So, you need these series of contractions and expansions to be able to feel safe in your body again. However, most people will block that contraction expansion with addictions, with pharmaceuticals, with anything that will distract them because it feels like that contraction expansion is so much that it's going to literally take them out. And think about like the birthing process when you're breathing and you're having those contractions, you feel like you're literally dying, right? Like it's so painful and you feel like it's never going to end. Well, that's exactly what it feels like in grief. So when we don't have techniques, which we're going to talk about today, to help with the contraction and expansion of these very heavy emotional emotions that are moving through us, and when your breath stays like that for years, then the energy gets stuck. And we need to learn again to re-educate ourselves to inhale and exhale so that we can start this release, right? And this is why breathing in Kundalini Yoga therapy is so important and meditation, because not only is it opening the chest, but you're also clearing the nadis and you're clearing the nadis where the prana moves through, where emotions move through. Specifically, there are specific meditations we're going to talk about today that clear those nadis, especially where grief is stored. Because in your body, there's a particular area that your grief is stored, which is actually part of your respiratory system. It's actually your lungs, which is why we have to understand grief scientifically and energetically. So, grief is not just an emotion and it's not a disease, it is chemistry. Think of it as chemistry. When you grieve, when you're in that grieving process, you have higher levels of cortisol. So what does that mean? That your blood vessels are going to constrict, that your diaphragm is going to tighten and may stay tightened, that your heart rate is going to become very irregular, and that your lymph movement is going to slow down, which is going to block up the release of those toxins. And that's why grief feels so overwhelming. Pressure in the chest, fatigue, brain fog, random waves of pain, ghost pain, even. The vagus nerve, which is a really important nerve in the nervous system that runs from the brain down to the throat, through the chest, and into the gut. It literally connects all these different organs. This nerve controls the entire breath and emotions. So it completely stops functioning the way it needs to. And so now, when you shut down the tears or the emotions, the vagus nerve tightens, and that tightness becomes breathing that is blocked. And think about all the organs that this vagus nerve is connected to: brain, throat, chest, gut. That's a lot to be impacted. And it's not weakness. You're not weak. You're not broken. It's just physiology. And this is why it's so important to understand how generations pass grief through their breath. Because children actually learn to breathe not only through mirroring, but through in the womb. When you were in the womb of your mother, if she was going through trauma, meaning fighting with your dad or her partner, maybe there was financial trouble where there wasn't enough money for food, maybe there was her own childhood trauma that she went through as a child, right? So that pattern of her breathing became your pattern in the womb because her nervous system pre-wired your nervous system in the womb. And if your mother was basically breathing very shallow because she lived under chronic stress, survival mode pretty much, that's what you learn too. That's what mirroring is all about. It's epigenetics, which is epigenetics basically is the way our genes express themselves based on our ancestors. But it also, you have to understand that mirroring means our neurons in our brain literally are shadowing and mirroring what we see in our mother, especially our father as well, which we're going to talk about more next month in the podcast series. But our mother in a very impactful way because she is our first connection, right? And so this is why even it really depends on you and your siblings will experience different types of generational trauma activating in you based on like what your mother's state of consciousness was. And that's why two siblings can face like the same event and respond differently. Because, for example, when I was born, my mom was migrating from Mexico to the United States of America. And there was a very high level of stress. I was the firstborn. There was a lot of stress from moving to a new country, getting a new job. There was more financial stress on us as the oldest daughter versus my youngest brother or my youngest sister. My mom and dad were at a completely different place in their lives. And even with my sisters, we had moved to Arizona. My other sister, the one that follows me, we were in California still, but mom was a little bit more settled and grounded. However, mom was going through a lot of depression because one of her sisters had transitioned, which was like an aunt to me. I mean, a mom to me. She is an aunt to me, but she's like my mom, right? So do you see, my mom was going through different phases of her life when each of us was born, which is why not all four of us are going to have an addiction. Not all four of us are going to experience the same childhood trauma. It's based on what mom and dad were, how present they were for you, what traumas they were dealing through, especially between the ages of 0 to 7. So we have to understand that it's not about blame, it's about awareness. And one big thing around awareness is that when it comes to grieving, women were never taught how to grieve. And think about all the reasons why we would need to grieve as a woman. We got miscarriages. How many women have ceremony around that? There was a woman in our community in the Sovereign Sisterhood Sanctuary who went through a miscarriage, and we all decided, we asked if we could have a ceremony for her to help her grieve that. And it was the most beautiful. Of course, she said yes. And it was the most beautiful ceremony in the world because not only did it help her with the grieving process, but when you do these ceremonies for other people and other women, it helps you as the woman. When you offer healing to others, you heal as well. And how many women in this world were never given the space, time, even the tools to grieve the loss of a miscarriage? We have women grieving abortions, women needing to grieve divorces, women needing to grieve the loss of a friendship, betrayal, infidelity, maybe even grieving the loss of childhood innocence. And especially women of color, is it's very common to just have this mentality of my parents did the best that they could and to just kind of accept it like a martyr. The first step of healing is awareness and acknowledgement that what I went through was horrific, and our emotions need to be validated by ourselves, by a community, right? Of I'm angry, I'm sad, I'm broken. And we need to grieve that loss of that childhood innocence before we can heal it. We also, as women, don't grieve our aging. We don't honor older ancestors or older family members the way we used to. We don't grieve lost dreams. We don't even grieve the mother we needed but did not have. This month in our community, the month of October, we worked on restoring the mother line. And in so much of what broke through in the women in our community was the fact that they could probably never fully change their mother, but what they needed to grieve was the fact that they needed a different mother and that mother couldn't show up for them. Without us grieving these things that feel like tremendous loss to us, the grief stays in your body. It goes inward. It stays in the chest. It blocks the lymph. It's in the entire endocrine system of your entire nervous system too. And then it becomes our identity. When there is no movement, when there is no ritual and ceremony for grief to move, it becomes your chemistry. And chemistry becomes inflammation. And inflammation becomes illness. Because what a lot of us don't know is that grief becomes trauma when the body never gets to finish something painful it experienced. You know, like an animal, I always use this analogy. A lion goes chasing the zebra, and then the zebra is running through the jungle, and the zebra escapes, and the doesn't eat him. The first thing that the zebra does, because that was a very traumatic experience, is the zebra will run and then it'll find a place where it can shake its body vigorously. And we do a lot of this in Kundalini Yoga therapy. Why is it just like shaking its body vigorously? Well, it went through trauma. There's cortisol, there's adrenaline, there's all these different chemicals that are flooding the system. So it needs to release those memories from the body. How many times have we been through something traumatic, either as a child, even a car accident? Like I said, all these things that we grieve and we don't do anything about it. We just throw a band-aid on it, a pharmaceutical, go into a coping mechanism, which is an addiction. This is not to shame or blame, but this is what we do because it's so overwhelming. And the whole thing is that you have to understand it in a couple of ways. There's what is known as post-traumatic stress, and we don't call this a disorder in Kundalini Yoga therapy because it's not a disorder. There's such thing as post-traumatic growth, which means this is not something that you're tied to for the rest of your life. So post-traumatic stress, which is also known as PTS, happens after something really traumatic, scary, shocking happens to you. And it doesn't matter when it happens, 20, 40 years ago, or even in past generations, because it's like the brain just keeps replaying the danger, even when it's over. And this is why sometimes you can wake up in the morning and all of a sudden you'll feel sweaty. You'll feel like your palms completely sweat and your nervous system, you can feel like your heart racing, like if you were experiencing the trauma and you're like safe in your bed. That's your nervous system and that's your brain replaying that danger, that trauma unconsciously. And then there's what is known as complex PTS. So it's a little bit different because complex PTS, which is very common for those that have experienced or are repeating patterns of generational trauma. Complex PTS happens when stress it keeps repeating for years and years and years and years. So like constant yelling, emotional neglect, continuing to have a relationship with a mother that is very much depressed or lives under her own patterns of generational trauma. Like if you were also constantly walking on eggshells, afraid to say anything because you might say the wrong thing, right? Or if you yourself just never feel safe in your body, that's complex PTS. So instead of one big event happening to you, like some kind of like abuse as a child, sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse, abandonment. And again, abandonment could be like your mom left you with your grandmother for 3 months, like my mom used to do to me because my mom would work in the United States and she didn't trust anybody in the USA. So she left me with grandma and grandma would take care of me, right? And it's not like grandma mistreated me. She loved me. She did absolutely the best she could based on her experiences and her all the grief that she carried too. But I didn't know that as a baby. Between the ages of 0 to 7, our brains are developing. All I knew was that mom wasn't there and I needed my mom's nervous system. That creates abandonment wounds. So it's not a lot of the times, our parents all the time they did these things unconsciously. Not a lot of the times. It's every time. It's unconscious. As much as you might say, my God, my mom was so evil, or my mom is so evil. These things are done unconsciously. Even your dad walking out completely on the family. That's unconscious. He's not doing that consciously. There's pain that's driving that. And when we don't grieve it, when we don't heal it, then it continues to impact the nervous system. And then the brain changes in a very big way, where the amygdala, which is like the alarm system, it's going to get louder for you, which is why high levels of anxiety, right? Hypervigilance, thinking the other shoe's going to drop, can't trust anybody. There's also an area of the brain that's called the hippocampus, and this is your memory organizer. And this shrinks. So you're forgetful, dementia, Alzheimer's, right? And then there's the prefrontal cortex part of your brain, which is responsible for emotional regulation. So it's responsible for compassion even. And it goes completely offline when you stay under complex PTS. And this makes it harder to especially breathe, to think clearly, of course, and to feel safe in your body. And the thing is that the lungs are going to react first because when the body feels danger and the breath then gets shallow, that's the fight, flight, or freeze program that the nervous system is operating under, which impacts the lungs. And that lowers your oxygen. It raises inflammation. It weakens your immune system, and it continues to impact the lymph movement. And the thing about the lymph is that when it drains slowly, like we've been talking about, that waste is going to build up. So it's like a sink, right? That can't empty itself. And there's all kinds of crazy illnesses that are linked to stored grief and chronic stress, or CPTS or PTS. Asthma, bronchitis, chronic cough, tight chest, allergies, immune issues, breast, lymph, swelling, which we all know what that's connected to. The C word, panic attacks, anxiety, depression, autoimmune flares, which have increased tremendously in the last few years, and chronic fatigue. When grief has no ritual or movement, then everything else is going to be impacted. And we as children learned how to not grieve through what we saw happening at home. So over generations, the body just doesn't know how to relax. The body, you don't know how to breathe, right? And when we think about breathing and our respiratory system, we are never just breathing for ourselves. We're breathing not only for everyone who couldn't 7 generations before, but also for 7 generations afterwards, because the breath is the bridge between the physical and the spirit. And the breath is what allows the lymphatic system, the river beneath your skin, that carries all these immune cells, that removes waste and regulates your inflammation and swelling, it allows it to actually do its work, do its job, right? To clean out the toxins. And when we don't, that's stagnation, which is why all ancestral grief is stuck in the lung meridians, which is why you'll notice that a lot of the meditations we use, we're going to talk about this right now, is in lifting our arms. What that's working is it's allowing the movement and the grief to move through us so it doesn't get stuck in the breast, so it doesn't get stuck in the armpits, so it doesn't get stuck in your chest. And this is why some women feel that swelling or that heaviness of emotional stress then showing up in physical illness. The body is simply saying, hey, you need to move this. And so a big part of this is obviously meditation, which we're going to get to, but it's also when you talk about something more serious, which is the lack of ritual, which is causing this stagnation, especially around grief and death. And why don't we as a Western society have rituals around death? Well, first, we have to understand that when colonization spread across all the indigenous lands, ancestral rituals were banned. And then they created religion. So they didn't ban them because they were evil. It was because that's exactly what healed families. That's what he empowered families. That's what made families emotionally strong. That's what created families that were spiritually connected, families that were community minded. Because when people know who they come from and where they come from, you can't control them. So the Bible, religion, and not the Bible, let's call it religion, told you to be afraid of ancestral honoring and ancestral basically altars. Why? Because basically you would not heal at the root cause. Think about it. When you stay angry at your ancestors and you don't do the work of forgiveness, if one of them has hurt you, then that repeats the pattern because that guarantees that you're going to reincarnate and you're going to stay in this reincarnation loop. When instead if we use the tools of Kundalini Yoga therapy and devotion to scripture like A Course in Miracles, which are the teachings of Jesus Christ, then you could do the things he did, which is forgive them, Father, for they know not what they did. So that is why religion has tried to make ancestral honoring and ancestral altars demonic or evil. But even in original scripture, we can see that ancestral honoring is something very important. For example, in Exodus 20:12, it says, honor your father and your mother. Well, doesn't that mean honor, meaning healing the lineage? Meaning, does that only mean when they're alive? What about when they transition? Then we just can't honor them anymore? We have to just forget about them completely? I don't think so. I think that what that means is to continue to honor means to continue to pray to them, to continue to honor their legacy and their memory by connecting with them, because nothing is lost in death and nothing is gained and birth, right? Also in Hebrews 12:1, it says, we are surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses. Who are the witnesses? Well, those are your ancestors that are here always to support and assist you. But if we're angry at them and if we don't have rituals to honor them, or we have all this grief that blocks us from doing that, then we can't even, they can't even assist us. They can't even help us. Also in scripture in Malachi 4:6, it says, he will turn the hearts of the children to their parents. He will turn the hearts of the children to their parents. What is that? This is generational healing. That's what that is. So when institutions replace ritual with fear, what we lost was community mourning. We lost storytelling. We lost breathing practices. We lost grounding tools. We lost music and the celebration of death as a sacred journey that it is. And without ritual, what happens? The body becomes the ceremony. It keeps all those emotions. And that's why rituals like El Día de los Muertos, which is the Day of the Dead, become so important in this world. And now I don't know if any of you have seen the movie Coco, and most of like those movies really miss the mark on the representation of the actual celebration. But this one was very close. There are some really negative things around the fact that I believe that they went back to the place where the grandmother Coco was to really reenact the full totality of the culture and traditions. But the only thing negative that I heard was that they used her, but they didn't even pay the woman money for her talent and all these things. So there's always all these controversies. But if you watch the movie, it gives a fairly good depiction of what Dia de los Muertos is, or Day of the Dead, which to me, that's my favorite celebration of the entire year. It used to be Christmas, and for the last probably 5 years, it's Dia de los Muertos has become so important to me. And for me, there was a big breakthrough moment when I went back to Mexico to actually celebrate it with my family. It was so amazing to be in this state of consciousness of emotions where I felt this complete like sadness and grief, but at the same time I felt this joy and happiness at the same time. And to be able to talk to my sons and to my husband about these things that are so taboo, like death, really healed us, and it brought us to the state of presence of like equanimity and more at peace with our own journey of the soul. And I've also taken a course as a Kundalini yoga therapist on the journey of the soul. And we've practiced, which we're going to talk about here next, to bring some peace and healing to you, to allow you to move through this grief, where we actually learned as a Kundalini yoga therapist the process of death, what happens after death, which is very similar to El Día de los Muertos and what Mesoamerican cultures like the Mexica, Purépecha, Maya taught about Dia de los Muertos and Day of the Dead, very similar teachings. And I took this course to not only understand the journey of the soul, but to really be at peace with my own existence and my own death. Because there were specific meditations and kriyas that are part of Kundalini Yoga therapy that can help you with this, and especially with grief. And it was such a life changing experience because when we can do that, we can absolutely be the presence that someone needs when they are moving through their sacred process of transitioning. And most of us can't really do this because when we see someone sick or when we see someone that has transitioned, all of our stuff comes up. And a big part of that again is because there is no ritual and because none of us were really taught about death. When I was growing up, my aunt transitioned when I was like 8 or 9 years old. She was my favorite aunt in the world. And I remember she was like a mom to my mom too. And when she transitioned, my mom went into like deep depression and we were not like allowed to talk about it. I just knew that she wasn't there anymore. And not only did my mom go into like deep depression, but I had a lot of questions and I had a lot of fear around death. And that carried me through life. And it was through my Kundalini yoga practice that not only was I able to release grief, but and then through the training as a Kundalini yoga therapist to really come to this place of neutrality and to really see death for what it is, which is a sacred process that is the exact same thing as birth. And this is exactly what our ancestors always knew. And Dia de los Muertos comes specifically from ancient Mesoamerican cultures. So this included the Mexica, which some people know as the Azteca or the Aztecs, but they're really the Mexica. That's the real name. Then we have the Mayan, we have the Tolteca tribe, and where right now it especially has flourished in a very big way is where my ancestors come from Michoacan, the Purépecha people. And all of our Mesoamerican cultures, they view death as a natural stage of the soul's journey. It wasn't something to be feared or an enemy. And Michoacan, where I'm from, the Purépecha traditions remain really strong. You'll see in Mexico and El Distrito Federal, El DF, the capital, huge celebrations, right? In San Miguel de Allende, that's where we went the first time for our celebration.
Amazing celebration, so beautiful. And we met people from all over the world there, which is how impactful this incredible celebration has become. Amazing, right? But in Michoacan, oh my gosh, in where we're from, I'm from a little rancho that's called San Antonio Campo, Michoacan, which the next biggest city would be probably Zamora. And it's probably like 2 hours away from Morelia. And near Morelia, there's a little town that's called Pátzcuaro or Lake Pátzcuaro, Lago de Pátzcuaro, which is in this little town that's called Janitzio. Janitzio is like an island. And this island is surrounded by this beautiful lake where the ancestors actually believed that this lake is where the spirits of the souls move through, especially on El Día de los Muertos. And they saw death as basically the circulation of breath, right? And they understood that if, especially on this day, they build these altars, the most of us have our altars up the entire year, but on the Day of the Dead, we have a great display of this altar, and we bring to the altar what is known as ofrendas to welcome the loved ones back home. So every item that we place on the altar on this beautiful day of November 1st has a very specific cultural function. So, for example, you'll see a lot of the marigolds, which in Spanish we call them the cempasúchil. These are the orange, beautiful flowers. And the bright orange symbolizes the sun, which our Mesoamerican cultures knew as Tonatiuh. And Tonatiuh represents the ability for our ancestors to basically follow the altar, follow the cempasúchil to the altar. It's the scent that creates the path, it's the colors that create the path that becomes the sensory bridge. And this is also neuroscience because think about it, smell is tied to emotional memory. So the cempasúchil create the path that bring back the ancestors where we place their pictures on the altar, right? To remember them again. And then we also place on the altar candles, which represent the fire element and the light of consciousness, where each flame helps the soul find its way through the darkness. And one candle may be placed for each ancestor that you're remembering. And then we offer water for hydration because we believe that spirits are definitely thirsty after such a long passage, right? And symbolically, water restores emotional circulation. Talk about grief, it's all about water and emotions, right? In altars, you're also going to see salt, which represents the purification and the protection against corruption or even decay. And anthropologically, salt preserves, right? It's the meaning memory should not rot. And then we also have what is known pan de muerto. I love pan de muerto. I usually get it from the same bakery here in town. And this is known as the bread of the dead. And it's shaped, sometimes it's shaped in a very beautiful design with even bone designs, which is honoring the skeletal form as a symbol of truth and equality in death. And bones are the last thing that the body surrenders, right? They represent the legacy. And you're going to see a lot of skulls, which are known as calaveras, and it's basically a reminder that death is part of life, not separate from it. It's not a costume party at all. It has nothing to do with Halloween. I don't even celebrate Halloween anymore. Like I'll support my nieces, right? And go trick or treating with them, and I would never take that from a child, right? But me personally, I don't. I've stopped celebrating Halloween probably like 6 years ago and during my healing journey, through my healing journey, just because I know that there's a lot of dark rituals that happen that day as well. So the skulls are not like a costume, it's the representation that death is part of life, not separate from it. And then on the ofrendas, we bring the favorite foods and their drinks so that the soul can enjoy that essence, that aroma. I like to cook pozole. My mouth is even watering with me saying that because pozole is such a one of the most favorite dishes of my ancestors and something that my grandma cooked for us and that I absolutely loved as well. So I like to cook pozole. Sometimes I'll cook some tamales. And each of my ancestors, whatever they liked, I bring it to the ofrenda as well. It was so interesting because I was cleaning my altar and I was getting it ready to for the celebration. And my grandfather on my dad's side of the family, his picture kept falling off, and I have him and my grandma together, his wife, my on my dad's side of the family, and it just kept falling and falling. And then it was so weird because as I was picking it up, and I healed an addiction to alcohol. I'm 7 years alcohol free. I have no desire for alcohol. But I kid you not, when I was cleaning the altar, I wasn't using any like chemicals or anything like that. And I started to smell alcohol. Like I started to smell tequila. Like I remember what wine smells like. I remember what different vodka, right, smells like. But this was like such a clear scent of tequila. My grandfather, on my dad's side especially, loved tequila. So I absolutely took that as a sign. My God, don't forget to bring him his tequilita, which a couple of my other uncles on there will probably enjoy too. And maybe even on my husband's side of the family, because in our altar we have both my side of the family and his side of the family. And this year is very, very sacred because this year there were so many cycles that were closed where a lot of those ancestors that are not on the altar have come to me in dreams or have come to me in my meditations affirming that these cycles were actually closed. So you're gonna offer whatever favorite foods your ancestors liked, right? We also use a lot of incense and we use copal. I love the sense of copal. Next to sage, copal is my favorite. And copal was actually used in pre-Columbian times. It purifies the space just like sage does, but especially with the ancestors, this is known to actually lift the prayers and it clears all this stagnant emotional energy. So it becomes like opening of the lungs during grief. So highly suggest you get also copal. And then we also are very much aware of the monarch butterflies. And the monarch butterflies actually come from Michoacan and they arrive in Michoacan every year around this date. And the Purepecha people believe still today that the butterflies carry the souls of the departed that are returning back home. And even biologists now call this migration ancestral memory in insects. It's actually pretty fascinating and beautiful. So this ritual of the celebration of the ancestors that have transitioned is so important for your nervous system because when modern society removed the ritual, that's where grief got stuck in the chest. When religion said it's evil, that's where hyperventilation became common. That's where depression increased, inflammation increased, the lymphs got stagnated. And that is very important to know because without ritual, we have unspoken goodbyes. It's so sad what happened with this pandemic because how many people were like transitioned and they because of this pandemic and this literally virus, could say so many things around that, they were not allowed to have proper burials. It's horrific. Now we have the family that stayed behind carrying all this grief and trauma. So all of these unfinished things in life, when we don't process it through grief, they become physical illness in us. And then it's something that gets passed down over and over. And so as a society, and I really do believe that we're going to get there within this next 10, 15 years, we will adapt and embrace what our ancestors always knew, that death is not a disappearance, it's a transformation. The relationship doesn't end either. Love does change form, but it doesn't end. And that the body is just borrowed as the temple for consciousness. That we are not the body, that we are an infinite soul having this experience. And a big part of why we're so afraid is because we don't know what happens in the afterlife, right? And if you grew up with religion, to be honest, they scared you instead of helping you, right? They talk about the purgatory and about how God is gonna judge you and basically say you're going to hell, you're going to heaven. That is so completely out of alignment with not only what all the indigenous teachings teach, and this goes back to even Egypt, not just in Mesoamerica, but also what yogic philosophy has known for thousands of years, because Kundalini yoga is the science of energy. and it's been around for 5,000 years. And so I want to share with you the yogic understanding of actual the journey of the soul, so that you can have a better understanding and maybe even more at peace, not only with your own journey but maybe the journey of others. And so the one thing I want to say before we get into that topic is that you yourself can also place an altar. It doesn't matter where you are from the world, we're all citizens of this world. So you can create an altar and you can place your ancestors' photos and the ofrendas. And what's amazing about this is that while you're doing that, is that you're repairing the identity fractures, the lineage memory, the emotional circulation, and the respiratory system. Because we have to remember that when colonization demonized ancestral reverence, it severed us from our roots, from our nervous system feeling like it belongs, right? And a big part of the altar is that altars are going to be that container for your grief so that it doesn't stay in your lungs. So they give the nervous system closure. That's what altars do. That's what the ritual of Dia de los Muertos does. It gives the nervous system coherence. It gives it regulation. And it's not superstition. This is ancient psychology. So Dia de los Muertos doesn't erase the grief. It allows the grief to move through you. It dignifies you. You're allowed to speak their names. You're allowed to light the candle. You're allowed to put the picture up there, regardless of what they did, right? And when you do this, when you honor your ancestors, you heal the root, the branches, you heal it all. Because ritual lets grief circulate. So it doesn't become illness in your body, in living. And that's what takes us then to the yogic journey of the soul. Because why grief becomes illness in living is because we stay behind with all of this remorse, with all of these emotions of like, I should have said this, I should have done that. What if I would have done this? What if I would have instead treated her like this or been like this? All this what if, what if, what if? And then we live in even more grief when we think, especially if there was like a sudden death or someone unalived themselves. Why? Because religion tells us, all these people are going to go suffer in hell now. Or who knows what happened to that soul because of all the way he behaved or she behaved here. That is so incorrect as it relates to indigenous teachings and also what yogic philosophy tells us about the journey of the soul. So I'm going to give you a very small breakdown of what Kundalini Yoga teaches as it relates to the process of death. Because once you really grasp this concept, your heart will open up and you will see what a sacred process it actually is. In Kundalini Yoga, we know that nothing is lost at death and nothing is gained at birth. When my teacher told me that in my Kundalini Yoga therapist class, it really stuck with me because the first time I actually took that course twice in 2023, and then I took it again in 2025 in October, just recently, a week ago. And when she said that, the first time I went to the course, I was grieving the transition of 3 family members in 1 year. So even though I'm done breaking cycles in my lineage and I teach other women now to do this, I still had grief. And this is why we practice our Kundalini yoga practice every day, because it's not about never having to heal again. It's about having the vitality to move through life and what life brings you. And you can't stop the transition of your family members, of your own transition. You can't stop the transition of your parents, of those that are pretty much ready to go, right? So when I first went to the class and she said that, I was like, Mom, what do you mean? Easier said than done. But then there were specific meditations and kriyas. And once I understood what the process of death was, things changed for me. And that very first time I took the course. And now this time around, I felt like such a pro. I felt like I was so connected to my soul. I felt like I could surrender to everything that was happening within me. So we have to understand that nothing is gained at birth, nothing is lost at death. The only thing that changes is the form. The only identity that changes is the form, because there is reincarnation or the soul graduating to the ethers where it now is a sage that helps others. We're going to go into that. But when the physical breath stops, the pranic field, which is basically your prana, your life force energy, and the subtle body and the soul, they separate. The subtle body is, remember we talked about this in the subtle anatomy of your body. You're not just a physical body, there's 10 layers of you. The subtle body incarnates with the soul. And we're going to talk about that with as it relates to samskaras, because the subtle body is the energetic blueprint that travels between lifetimes with your soul, with your soul. And it holds samskaras. This is very different than karma. Because karma is what you do, there's an effect in the physical while you're living. But samskaras are inherited. They come from your past lives, trauma, from your ancestors. That's what a samskara is. And that's what keeps us in this reincarnation loop because of those samskaras. And those are in what is known as the subtle body. So then when we incarnate, when we take our first breath, we're incarnating with the soul, which is, and the subtle body, those two of the 10 bodies that you are. And then your samskaras, these inherited traumas, become the curriculum of your life. Life, this university, this thing called life is a university. And so that shows up as the curriculum of life. That's why I 1,000% believe, and yogic philosophy talks about this, that we pick our own parents. They don't choose us, we pick them. So it becomes a curriculum of our life, basically meaning the patterns that we have to face to stop the loop of reincarnation. That's why Jesus Christ did not need to reincarnate anymore, because he said, "Forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do." I am not a body. I am not here to teach you about the crucifixion. I'm here to teach you about the resurrection, that you will rise again, meaning through another life, or again, once I take you through this journey of the soul, you might graduate into now be like a sage like Jesus Christ, right? To help others. So, A Course in Miracles, which is the teachings of Jesus Christ, says that the curriculum is chosen for you. You have free will in the physical body when you're here, but you are under the will of God, which means you might have to do this lifetime a lot of times, reincarnate, but you will always go back to God in atonement like Christ did. When that happens, well, there's tools to help you with that. It's a big part of generational healing, because the reason why we keep reincarnating is because there's still people we need to forgive. The curriculum has to continue to show up. So it's not punishment, the curriculum, it's your remembrance. So when you learn to respond differently to what your ancestors responded with, anger, pain, without forgiveness, and not because they were broken, it's because they didn't have the tools to change their nervous system and their brain. But when you learn to respond differently, which you listening to this podcast episode is you learning to respond differently, that's when your grandmother's shame clears. That's when your mother's breath expands from staying stuck in grief. That's when your future daughter's nervous system changes. So when you breathe through old patterns, you meditate. That's what Jesus Christ talked about throughout the entire scripture. Meditate, meditate, meditate. You release the contraction that your lineage never could. Remember, contraction, expansion, contraction, expansion. So all that pressure we feel, even behind the sternum, it's not random. It's inherited tension that's wanting to leave the body. And this is why lineage healing happens in the lung meridians, because the lung stores your grief, ancestral grief. This has been proven in yogic science. And if we look at science in general, we can actually prove this as well. And then what happens when the lungs store the grief? The lymph drains emotional waste, right? So if the lymph drains emotional waste, it can do that. And then what happens? We add more samskaras to our subtle body. So when we leave, we have more work to do in the next lifetime. But when you actually retrain your nervous system, this is what the Kundalini Yoga therapy approach is. First, when it comes to grief, we actually don't start with the nervous system. We start with meditations and kriyas that are actually going to target or focus on your lungs and the lymph. We have to address grief at the level of your respiratory system, at the level of your biology, right? So there's certain things that we do in Kundalini yoga that help with that. So it's chanting specific sound frequencies, mantra. Why? There's nothing more powerful than for healing than your own voice. And sound vibration, it moves these stuck emotional patterns in the chest and in the throat. That's the movement that I was talking about to help with the contractions and expansions. Because what it's doing is it's creating resonance in the vagus nerve, which we talked about. It's rewiring the way you breathe, your nervous system. It's opening the rib cage. That's incredible. And when we're consistent, you're expanding the lung capacity to hold more prana. That's what releases pressure on the diaphragm. You're chanting, and it restores oxygen to the areas of the brain that shut down during grief. So when the diaphragm learns to relax again, what happens? The lymph that surrounds the lungs, it can drain again. And this is very important so that we don't get physically sick later, right? And then there's movement, right? We have specific meditations and kriyas, which is a recipe of movements you do to get a specific chemical result in the body that help stretch the rib cage, that help move the energy in the lung meridians, in the armpits, in the chest, right? And this creates this mechanical flow. It's like pumping a sponge, clearing all the stagnation that forms after emotional shock. And movement is not just moving your body, like movement is chanting, movement is breathing, movement is sitting in stillness, but placing your eyes at the middle of the forehead with your eyes closed. All of that is movement because it's repeating, it's consistent, it's regulating and changing the lungs and the lymph so that it ultimately starts to begin the process of rewiring the nervous system and the brain. Because when the rhythm stabilizes and it changes from trauma, hypervigilance, trauma, the lungs are going to expand more and the lymphatic system is going to drain more efficiently, right? And then the other thing about this is also community. When we are grieving, which can turn into depression as our identity, we typically do not want to be around other people. And that is very, very bad for your health because practicing in group, being part of a community is what will help you release the identity and reduce the isolation that would further drive you into the grief. And that's for a few reasons. First of all, understanding that you're not the only one in the world that's going through this. There are other women that have not only gone through what you're going through, but have transcended it, have healed. That gives you hope, that gives you faith. It also makes you feel like you're not crazy. And to be honest with you, one of the things that Yogi Bhajan said, who brought Kundalini Yoga from the East to the West, some of our challenges and traumas and the grief that we carry cannot be carried on our own. Many times the women will come to my classes and to our community, and they might not speak and they might not even share anything and they might not even practice. They'll just come and listen to the class. And guess what? That does just as much of an impact as them fully practicing in the full class because the brain doesn't know the difference between imagining and perceive and actually experiencing. And that's what being part of a community does. It pulls you out from these dark holes that grief absolutely wants to take us through. And meditation. Now, Kundalini Yoga meditation has been proven to work really effective for those that are experiencing grief and post traumatic stress or CPTS, complex post traumatic stress. Why? Because there's a lot of movement in it. And a lot of the work, especially when I'm working with someone with PTS, like there is so much movement that it will prohibit or it will prevent them from going into what is known as relaxation induced anxiety, which happens when someone's running a lot of cortisol and adrenaline through their body because of trauma and grief. To tell them to like sit and meditate and close their eyes and just try to close their eyes can actually induce a lot of anxiety. So we have to take different approaches. And you'll notice with Kundalini Yoga meditation, a lot of it is it requires movement. And that movement is what's going to help move the cortisol and adrenaline and the grief so that you don't feel like you're going deep into this hole and not come out. And in fact, there is this really powerful Kundalini yoga meditation that is for ancestral grief. Now, here on my YouTube channel, I have the releasing ancestral karma meditation. That one I practiced myself for close to, it was like 120 days. Very powerful in itself. But the one I'm referring to is known as the ancestral grief meditation. And the reason why this one's specific to grief, and this not only is my personal experience, but this is from being a Kundalini yoga therapist, is that it really focuses on the lungs, the lymph, and your subtle body. So the ancestral grief meditation is one where we're sitting in easy pose or on a chair. We're cupping our hands together. And then what we're doing is we're inhaling through rounded mouth. And while we're doing that, we're bringing our hands over our head like we're like pouring water behind us. We're exhaling here through the mouth. And then we're bringing the hands down. And we're moving fast with this, with our eyes closed. So, for example, it looks like this. So, I'm going to try that rhythm again. It's inhale, exhale back. And as you can see, what I'm doing is I'm using breath and I'm bringing my arms back as much as possible. This is particularly working with the lung meridians, which is where grief is actually stored. So if you look here, these are the lung meridians that are connected to the nose and then move through the lungs. And when grief is not, there's no movement, it gets stuck in these lung meridians. So as you're moving your hands back and you're doing the inhaling and exhaling through the nose, you are basically allowing that vibration of the chest, that movement of the diaphragm, that breath to change, which actually allows the lymphatic system to drain that waste and that emotional chemistry that was created through trauma. So during this meditation, you're going to be able to like not only feel the sensations of emotions moving through you, which might cause you to cry, might cause you to feel angry, might cause you to go into bliss. It's all a different experience based on what your body's ready to release. And through that, you're able to allow the lungs to expand, which were contracting through the grief that gets stuck there, right? And in that, you're also expanding the rib cage because every inhale and exhale is supporting that. It's retraining your diaphragm to release the contraction around the heart center. So as the ribs open, these old breathing patterns inherited from trauma, they begin to literally unwind. And this is so important too because it also works on the subtle body, this meditation. And the way it works on the subtle body is in helping you clear those samskaras that I was talking to you about that are inherited from your ancestors and from past lifetimes. And this is key to get off of the hamster wheel of reincarnation. And you can't set it as a goal. All you have to do is do the practice and actually surrender and trust the process of it. That's basically it. Because what you're doing with these meditations is that you're also preparing for your death. Just the way we prepare for our birth, like when you're gonna have a baby, you have a birth plan, you got a backpack ready, you went to the breathing classes. It's the same thing for death. It's the same thing. You have to learn to live consciously in order to die consciously. Those that struggle at their last breath is because of all the resentment and all of the regrets and remorse that they have of not living a full life. So through this meditation, you're preparing yourself for that last breath because even through basically the journey of the soul and the last breath that you take, there's a whole afterlife that happens. So in Kundalini Yoga, we actually know that after you actually take your last breath, what's happening is that the soul and the subtle body still hang around the body for like 17 days, up to 17 days. And the subtle, it hangs around the soul because what it does is that it moves through these different ethers. And there's 5 ethers in total. Before it goes through these ethers, it depends on how much clearing of those samskaras you did here. Based on that, which ether you go to. So when the physical breath stops, the pranic field and the subtle body, they separate, right? And especially the first 3 to 4 days, the subtle body is going to stay close to visiting loved ones, to offering closure, to witnessing grief, right? To completing unfinished emotional bonds. And this can take up to 17 days. And that's why so many cultures light candles and they speak their names for several days. In Kundalini Yoga, we actually chant a mantra that is known as akal, akal, akal. And this is a sound frequency that allows basically the soul to move through its next assignment. But then there's basically these ethers that the soul moves through. And after this period of the first few days of hanging around the body, the subtle body with the soul moves through the electromagnetic field of the earth. So beyond the electromagnetic field of the earth over the 17 days, it travels through what is known as the blue ethers. In yogic philosophy, we know this to be true. And the first ether is the review. And this is where a lot of religion tries to make you very afraid of this process, because this is the review process, but it's not a punishment. It's just clarity. The soul basically is going to see the curriculum of its choices, what was learned, what was avoided. It's not God crossing his hands or her hands, however you see God, and judging you. It has nothing to do with that. So that's the first ether, where there's like this review that happens, right? Then the soul moves in through to what is known as a second ether, and that's completion. The lessons that were unfinished are then integrated, and the patterns that were repeated are basically understood. And then there's a third ether, which is the ether of service, where the subtle body, which is with the soul, conjoined with the soul, can then serve to loved ones as intuition, guidance, or protection. And this is where the ancestral support originates. Then there's also the fourth ether, where the soul, if there's enough work that was done here in the physical body, the soul literally can go into the fourth ether and stabilize in pure awareness without needing a physical form. So no more contraction. If most of us will not get to radiance, obviously, especially in our first few um, incarnations, we'll make it to service sometimes, but many of us don't even get to completion, which means we have to reincarnate. If somebody unalives themselves, they don't go into hell, they incarnate immediately. The people that stay behind feel like they live in hell because of all the things that religion makes us feel about the guilt around it, right? But there is no God that puts them in a hell per se. And this is also the truth for somebody who did really evil things. They might just reincarnate to relearn those curriculums. For those that died suddenly, like in a car accident or something really fast, those are souls that reincarnate very quickly. There's another assignment that calls to them very, very quickly. So not all the souls enter all of these different ethers. It depends on what meditation work you've done here, how much you've cleared the samskaras, which is what this meditation is all about, right? And so after radiance, if you make it to radiance where the soul stabilizes in pure awareness without needing physical form, no more contraction, there's still the fifth ether. And this is where like Christ, right? Where the yogis and the sages, and this ether is known as union. And that's individual consciousness dissolves into the universal mind, into the universal consciousness. And in yogic cosmology, there is no eternal punishment. There's no burning, there's no torture. All of us are gonna get to the fifth ether eventually. It just depends on the work that we do here in these physical bodies. And so consciousness just circulates. As Jogi Bhajan said, death is the merging of breath into the infinite. That's all that death is. It's a psychedelic experience. I've heard many people talk about this as it relates to like near death experiences. And all of their stories sound very similar to when I went to work with plant medicine in the Amazon jungle with Mother Ayahuasca. I literally have experienced and seen the things that they see in near death experiences, which is why there's a lot of people that are wanting to bring psychedelics in to the death process because it will give people more ease and more kind of surrender for the entire journey. But ultimately, it really is a sacred process. And if it happens quickly, obviously, or suddenly, then it does leave a lot of grief for those that stay behind. But us learning how to support ourselves during grief is very important because that's what's going to end the pattern of grief getting repeated, and especially these very tragic deaths getting repeated over and over and over again. So, how do we support ourselves through grief? Well, first, you have to re educate yourself in how to breathe. And that's done through the lungs, through the lymph, and especially then through the nervous system and through the brain. And that's where Kundalini Yoga therapy comes into play. Also, having a devotion to God, a spiritual practice, basically, every day, where you're able to allow those contractions and expansions to move through you, and where you're able to reconnect back to the source, to God, because grief separates us from that. A trauma separates us from that. It gives us the illusion that we're separate from God. The other thing that's very important, things that are going to help you walking. Walking is so good for your nervous system. It's much better than running or any exercise because walking works specifically on the nervous system for women. And we need those contractions, we need those expansions. So if you can walk in nature, even better, with no technology, just simply literally setting a time for you to just get out and create that movement. Walking is a meditation. The other thing that's going to help you, journaling is very, very powerful. Writing things without having to stop yourself. And then, like we've talked about, of course, with Kundalini Yoga therapy, the chanting, there's specific chants, specific mantras, the meditation, the breathing. But overall, community. You cannot do this alone. Do not do this alone. You don't have to. And that's why it's so important. Like when you're grieving, especially if it's the loss of a loved one, do not make any major decisions for at least a year. Because the first year, most people live in a huge fog, and it's not until the 1 year mark that it really hits the fan. Like you're like, this really happened. So it's very important that you know that your nervous system is still reorganizing itself from the contraction and from the expansion. So do not make any big major decisions like a divorce or moving or things like that. And really surround yourself by people that are going to see you, that are going to support you, that are going to help you come out of those contractions, right? Even in the birth process, you're not doing it alone. And so you are allowed to pause. You don't have to be strong all the time. As an older daughter, that's what I thought my role was, right? I have to keep it together for my family. You can rest. You can absolutely say no. There's no deadline as to when grief has to be healed. You have to really understand that love moves through you, and that what you're working through in grief, in the grief process, is releasing guilt and releasing all the emotions that might get stuck that are connected to the loss. And it's important to also know that perhaps our lineages did not have this luxury to do that, but that you are the completion. Because what we become is we create and rebuild our inner altar through meditation. And when we can do that, our ancestors can come to the altar. We can come to our altar. People from the physical existence can come to the altar and feel safe. So I invite you all to, especially this week as we celebrate El Día de los Muertos, the Day of the Dead, to build that altar inside your chest. You don't have to physically build one, to build it inside of your heart through meditation. Because every chant, every inhale, every exhale becomes a release for you, for your ancestors, for the grief that has been stored there for who knows how long, right? Remembering that as we breathe, the ancestors are also breathing through us. And that ritual is not superstition, it's nervous system science. And so, if this episode moved anything inside of you, I would love for you to share this with somebody that you love, share it with your community, hit that like button and subscribe. And if this work is calling to you, there's a reason why you're listening to this today. then we also invite you to join us inside the Sovereign Sisterhood Sanctuary, where inside we literally heal 7 generations before and after us. We move grief out of the lungs. We open the limbs. We release the samskaras so we get out of this reincarnation loop. We rewire the nervous system and the brain, and we restore identity through our breath. Build your inner altar. Light that inner candle of your inner temple and breathe for all of the women who perhaps could not. And the last thing I'll leave you with is to remember that nothing is gained at birth and that nothing, nothing is lost at death. Breath is the bridge. And I thank you for being here and for your courage. Your breath liberates 7 generations before and 7 generations after you. Now, again, thank you so much for the subscribe. Thank you for the like, and thank you for sharing. I will see you next week as we continue to explore generational healing, healing 7 generations before and after us.